Open your Bibles to the Gospel of John. The very end of chapter 18 is where we'll begin. We're kind of in the middle of the flow of the trials of Jesus. You remember from the last few weeks, really the last few months, that looking at where we are today, just going back a few days to the previous Sunday, we had the triumphal entry. Jesus comes in with great applause, people welcoming him. We know that as Palm Sunday today. And then Monday through Thursday of that week, Jesus is teaching in the temple. People are hearing him gladly. He is silencing the religious leaders as they try to entrap him. And in the evenings, they go out of the city, they camp on the Mount of Olives, and they come back early in the morning and do the same thing. And then Thursday night, they share the Passover meal together. They're in the upper room, and John spends much time explaining the prayers and the teaching and the dialogue there in the upper room. Late that night, Jesus goes out to the Garden of Gethsemane, is betrayed by Judas, and is arrested. He's taken before two Jewish religious rulers, Annas and then Caiaphas, and there are two trials that night. And then early in the morning, they move through the third religious trial before the Sanhedrin. And after those three religious trials, they come to the three civil trials before the Roman government. And this is where we are now, in the middle of this first trial before Pontius Pilate. Last week, we looked at the interaction between Pilate and the Israelites. We called that the depravity of Israel. And then Pilate and Jesus, we called that the nobility of Jesus. And so as we talked about the death that the Israelites were seeking for Jesus, and then the kingship that Jesus was explaining to Pilate, we came to the end, Pilate asking the question, what is truth? And so now we begin and we look at this Roman trial of Jesus continuing. I want to read, we'll begin in verse 38 of chapter 18, and this morning our goal is to go through verse 12 of chapter 19. Pilate said to him, what is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I release for you the king of the Jews? So they cried out again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. Pilate then took Jesus and flogged him. And when the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a purple robe on him. And they were coming to him and saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and were giving him slaps in the face. And Pilate came out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. Jesus then came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, Behold the man. So when the chief priest and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify, crucify. Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and by that law he ought to die because he made himself out to be the Son of God. Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he became more afraid, and he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you? Jesus answered, You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin. As a result of this, Pilate kept seeking to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself to be a king opposes Caesar. We begin there at the end of chapter 18, and we see first Jesus acquitted by Pilate. He's acquitted by Pilate. You remember that Jesus is speaking to Pilate about truth in the praetorium, the governor's residence. Pilate's response to that is, you see that in the very beginning of verse 38. What is truth? And he says this not in any real interest for an answer, because he turns away right away and goes back out to the Jews and says, I find no guilt in him. So he's indifferent to the answer that Jesus might give him, even though Jesus is the truth himself. And he moves from the private interview with Jesus in the praetorium, and he goes outside in the patio porch area to the crowd of people. The sun is rising. The crowd is swelling. At first, earlier in the early morning, you had just the Sanhedrin and the elders, but now people are starting to join in. And Pilate makes this declaration there at the end of verse 38, I find no guilt in him. Now, this is an official declaration. He's the governor. He has the right to make this decision. He has examined Jesus. He says there's no crime. He is not guilty, we would say in our courtroom vernacular today. In his mind, Jesus was all about some sort of spiritual, abstract idea. And he was not dangerous. The Roman government had nothing to fear from this man. And so he makes his declaration. What he should have done here is clear. Jesus is not guilty. He should release him at once. But we have the beginning now of the political dance between Pilate and the Jews. As we move through these civil trials, we get the impression that over and over again, Pilate, he's doing everything he can to dismiss this case. He just wants to be away from it. You remember there's great animosity between him and the Jewish people. He didn't want to please them. He didn't want to do what they said. But at the same time, deep down, he's afraid of them because they can use their influence against him with the Roman government higher-ups. So up to a point, he is willing to do what justice demands, especially if it can anger the Jews. But at the same time, he's only willing to do this up to a point. When his position is threatened, he surrenders. Now, we're going to stop right here. I'm going to ask you to flip over to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23 and verse 5. Luke 23 and verse 5. You remember when we said that the Apostle John in his Gospel focuses in on the trials before Pilate. Luke is the one who brings in this second trial with Herod. You remember the civil trials under the Roman government go Pilate, Herod, Pilate. And so Luke brings in this detail, beginning in verse 5. The same thing's going on. There's a crowd of Jewish people led by their religious leaders, and Pilate saying, I find him not guilty. Verse 5, they kept insisting, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place. Now, what happens is, when Pilate hears, oh, Galilee, he knows Herod has that jurisdiction, and this is a way he can get rid of this trial. He'll just send him over to Herod. Maybe Herod will take care of this, and I can be done. And so he does so. Look at verse 8. When Herod saw Jesus, he rejoiced greatly, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. And he questioned him at some length, but he, this is Jesus, answered him nothing. The chief priests and the scribes were standing there, vehemently accusing him. So you have the same exact scene in front of Herod that you had at the Praetorium in front of Pilate. Verse 11, and Herod with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a bright robe and sent him back to Pilate. Look down at verse 13. Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, you brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found in this man no guilt of what you are accusing him. Nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us, and behold, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. Therefore I will punish him and release him. End of the trial before Herod. Now, go back to John chapter 19. Chapter 18, we're still in the very end here as Pilate's communicating, I find no guilt in him. Now we bring in another man, and that is Barabbas. Look at verse 39. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Other gospel writers, they attested this fact. Matthew says, at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. This was an act of goodwill by the Roman government. Most of the prisoners were rebellious against the Roman government. And so the Jewish people would be eager to have these leaders of the zealotry of the Jews back in their midst. And so the Roman government would do this once a year. The Jews would look forward to this. There were discussions about who should they ask for this year. Luke says it this way, that Pilate was obliged to release a prisoner for them. This, of course, just follows the principle that if you give something to somebody over and over and over again, it becomes an expectation, and that you have to give it to us because you've done it all these years past. And so Pilate makes this offer. Verse 39, toward the end, do you wish then that I release for you the king of the Jews? Now the question itself, it implies that Jesus too is a criminal, even though he was just declared innocent. What should Pilate have done? Released him already. Pilate is throwing contempt at the Jewish people here by giving Jesus this title. He's mocking those religious leaders. It's also dishonoring to Jesus. How do they respond? Verse 40, so they cried out again, saying, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. In John's account, Barabbas is just kind of thrown in here. All of a sudden, he's here. What we see the Jewish people doing, as you think about Pilate, he expects them to say, yeah, that's a good idea. Release for us this man Jesus. After all, 5 days earlier, he had been praised in the triumphal entry. There were crowds of people, thousands of people listening to his teaching. Pilate had heard about this. But they cry out with loud emotion. And John says they cried out again. And so understand that as the gospel writers are communicating the scene here, and they use little words like this here and there, it's not just one sentence, one sentence, one sentence, one sentence. It is a crowd of people, a kind of a mob mentality, back and forth arguing, and lots of words said by Pilate and the religious leaders and the crowd. It seems that as they cry out again, not this man but Barabbas, that the crowd has been prepared. They're unified in what they're saying. What happened? Well, you can see that while Jesus is being examined, the religious leaders are outside and they're scheming. As evil as the religious leaders are, they're shrewd. They're good at this whole political thing. They know how to influence people using whatever means they thought necessary. So as the crowd grows outside, there's talk about who they should release in this year's annual prisoner release. And they're doing their work. It's like rallying people to vote during a certain campaign. They're talking against Jesus. You can hear them planning and plotting with each other. And this desire they had to do away with Jesus had been simmering for years. Now they must work quickly. They have the opportunity, so they spread the word. They highlight the disappointment. The triumphal entry. Yes, it happened a few days ago, and yes, that was exciting, they might say, but he's obviously not the Messiah because he's not overthrowing the Roman government. And you all know, as they speak to the Jewish crowd, that that's what the Messiah is going to do. He's going to take over. This man is tied up inside there. There's no way he's the real Messiah. We're sorry, but he misled you. And so a sentiment begins to grow. They need a replacement, and they decide to focus in on Barabbas. John says simply Barabbas was a robber. Matthew adds some detail, calling him a notorious prisoner. And so not only do the Jewish leaders stir up the crowd by speaking anti-Jesus sentiment, they speak pro-Barabbas sentiment. He's chosen by them as an ideal candidate for release. Matthew says the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas. Mark adds the chief priests stirred up the crowd. And again, you think about, well, how did they do this? Pretty simple as you think of things politically. They could explain to the crowds that if you take Jesus as the one who should be released, you'd be playing right into the hands of Pilate. And you all know what kind of man Pilate is. You don't want to be on his side. He wants to release him. You should just therefore not release him because of that very reason. That's reason enough. But then they can add to it. They can remind them that just a moment ago, Pilate had mocked you all by calling this man, Jesus, your king. They could recount all the crimes that Pilate had carried out against the nation. And in the end, they could simply intimidate people who weren't going along with their plan. Barabbas, his name means son of a father. Not a lot of detail there because all sons are sons of fathers. He's a criminal, but don't think of a petty thief. Again, Matthew calls him a notorious prisoner. Luke adds he was imprisoned for involvement with an insurrection and murder. Bandits like this, as we mentioned earlier, were common under Roman occupation. The leaders were well known, and it could be that Barabbas is connected with a group of thieves who are connected with the two thieves with whom Jesus will be crucified in just a few hours. As you put all the details of all the gospel writers together, you could make an argument that Jesus died on the very cross planned for Barabbas. This choice made by the crowd, although entirely unjustified, entirely evil beyond words, it was in accordance with the good plan and providence of God. Everything is going according to plan. So we move from Jesus being acquitted by Pilate to Jesus mistreated by the soldiers. Look there at chapter 19, verse 1. Pilate then took Jesus and flogged him. Again, John, depending upon the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke already having been written, he is very straight to the point. Not a lot of detail here. Jesus here is scourged. A scourging or a flogging in that day would involve tying the victim to a pillar or to a stake and beating him with rods or scourges called scorpions. Historians, ancient historians like Josephus and Eusebius, add detail to what this involved, this scourging. A Roman scourge consisted of, this is the implement now, it consisted of a short wooden handle to which several thongs of leather were tied, and at the end of each of those thongs would be a piece of lead or brass or sharp pointed bits of bone. And as they whipped the prisoner, they would do so most often along the victim's back as he was bent over with arms around that post or stake. Now, the viciousness of the beating often would result in tears and lacerations, not just to the surface skin, but as historians describe it, that deep-seated veins and arteries, sometimes even intestines and inner organs, were exposed. This kind of flogging, of course, Roman citizens couldn't receive this. They were exempt. But as the prisoner moved through this experience, they often fainted. Oftentimes they just died because of the extreme nature. Now, why does this happen here? Why does it say Pilate took Jesus and flogged him? Well, on the surface, this was normal as far as a preliminary legal punishment against a person who's going to be executed. But in this case, technically it's illegal because Pilate had declared him innocent. You can see the conflict in Pilate even here. He's trying to satisfy the Jews with some sort of punishment, and at the same time he wants to avoid putting Jesus to death. Perhaps they'll be satisfied, he's thinking. Going a little bit deeper, though, spiritually speaking, you can ask the question, why does Jesus allow this? Why does God allow this? Well, as we've mentioned, as we'll continue to mention, as we think about this physical punishment Jesus receives, this is all in preparation for him to be crucified and separated from his Father. Again, Hebrews 5, 7, and 8. He learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And as if you think about his time on the cross, the pinnacle of that time is the separation from the Father. All of the suffering moves up to that time, and each element of suffering gets more and more extreme so that the obedience on the cross will be fulfilled. You can picture Jesus after receiving this flogging, covered with bruises, lacerations, and welts. And you understand as well that this is a fulfillment of prophecy. Isaiah 53 speaks about the suffering of the man of sorrows, the fact that his suffering was intense and it was vicarious, meaning it was done in place of you and me. Isaiah 53:5, for example, he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening for our peace fell upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. Be careful here. Don't leave Jesus' sufferings just at the physical. If he would have stopped here, that would not have been enough, right? The physical are tied in with the spiritual suffering at the hands of the Father on the cross. It all goes together, and Isaiah brings out what we can see, and so this helps us understand the extremity of his suffering. The mistreatment continues here under the soldiers. Verse 2, and when the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head. Somewhere in the area, the soldiers found some thorny twigs. Many commentators identify the plant, which is actually called Spina Christi. Over time, it has come to have that name, a shrub that has branches with long spikes on it and whose leaves resemble the ivy used during crowning an emperor or a general. It could be that's possible, but there are an abundance of different possibilities as far as thorns go in Israel. Let me ask you, where in the Bible did we first hear the word thorn? Genesis chapter 3. Remember, Genesis is the book of beginnings. Genesis 1 through 11, all beginnings right there. So the thorn begins there at the curse of Adam. God says, the ground will now produce for you thorns and thistles. And you think about what's going on here. In connection with Adam's fall, Jesus bearing the curse that lies upon all of creation. So they take the time to put together this crown of thorns and they put it on his head. They don't set it on his head. They cruelly force it down on his head. And again, as you understand the depravity of these soldiers, this would cause blood to run down the head profusely. As you think about the skin that covers your head, it seems like there may not be much there because there's not much muscle beneath the surface. But there's a lot of blood vessels there. And this is what comes down Jesus' face, his neck, his body. Still sore, aching from the scourging. It's clear they want to torture him. It's a mock coronation they're doing with this crown. And it goes on because at the end of verse 2, it says, and they put a purple robe on him. Remember, he had been stripped of his outer garments. And so they put this robe on him, a color of royalty, scarlet, purple. Some of the other gospel writers speak of a different color. You might think of a robe with a variety of colors. You might connect this with the robe that Herod put on him. Somehow, some way, maybe a discarded robe from a Roman official who had thrown it aside, whatever. It's a garment that would be put on him, be used for mockery. And as time went on, it would stick because of all the wounds. The soldiers continue Verse 3, they were coming to him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and were giving him slaps in the face. You can see them taking turns, marching up to him, feigning respect, giving a mock salute, and giving further mistreatment as they hit him in the face. These actions reveal the wickedness of these soldiers and the lack of morality, we'll say, in the Roman Empire as a whole. Dostoevsky said, "A society should be judged not by how it treats its outstanding citizens, but by how it treats its criminals." And so this fits in with this godless mindset, not only seen in Pilate, but seen in these Roman soldiers. It seems that these soldiers are acting on their own. We don't have an indication here that they're ordered to do so by Pilate. Evidently, he's inside his residence while this occurs. So we've seen Jesus acquitted by Pilate and mistreated by the soldiers. We come third to this, hated by the Jews. Hated by the Jews. Look at verse 4. Pilate came out again. So again, Jesus being mistreated by the soldiers. The Jews are waiting outside. Pilate's inside. He says to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him." The word behold, he's looking to get attention. He's saying, look, and he wants to summarize everything and put an end to this. He's not guilty. He's trying very hard to find a way so that, on the one hand, he can avoid ordering Jesus to be crucified, and, on the other hand, escape the revenge of Annas and Caiaphas and the religious leaders. He should have, again, at this point, immediately released Jesus. Now, again, we're in the third Roman trial. Pilate, Herod, Pilate. This is the last trial. Look at verse 5. Jesus then came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Still bearing the mockery of the Romans, and now he will be mocked by the Jews. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." He exclaims as an introduction, here's the man that we're talking about. This could be intended to elicit sympathy for Jesus in the crowd of the Jews. They can look at him and see him for the fact that he suffered. Look at the blood. Look at, he's bent over. He's exhausted. He's so pitiable. Has he not suffered enough? Pilate's hoping they'll just let him go. As well, there is the idea that this king of the Jews, it just can't be true. Because you look at him, he can't be the king of the Jews. We just need to let him go. He's not a dangerous man. Your charge against him as being the king of the Jews is not going to stick because look at him. There's no chance he's going to be a rebel against the government. But even as he says, "Behold the man," Pilate is completely unaware of the reality that Jesus is the man. He is the greatest man in all of human history. Just as he missed the fact that Jesus was the truth right in front of him, he misses the fact that Jesus is the ideal man, the God-man. Verse 6. So when the chief priest and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify, crucify." They cry out. They look at him, and there's just this guttural response. You can imagine the most hard-hearted in the crowd. They shout first. The sight of him, bloodied and beaten, confirmed in their minds, this is not the Messiah. He has led far too many people astray. And so as the crowd sees this, all the thoughts that they had, all the doubts that they may have had, is this really the Messiah? All the lies that the religious leaders had communicated to them about Jesus. This all coalesces into one unified outrage, and they urgently and aggressively shout, "Crucify, crucify." They want Jesus killed. They don't say it just once. They don't say it in a calm spirit. They say it over and over and over again. Crucify, 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 crucify. What's happening here? Well, in our civilized day and age, we would call this mob mentality. There's a psychological event going on here. As everybody is moving in the direction against Jesus, other people jump on. This mob mentality is when people just join the crowd because that's the majority and that's the way people want to be viewed as part of the majority. How does Pilate respond? Look at the middle of verse 6. Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." This is the third time Pilate has declared Jesus is innocent. No guilt, no guilt, no guilt. Why is God allowing this? Again, we look to Isaiah 53. Listen to verse 6. "But Yahweh, the Lord, has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. He was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was cut off out of the land of the living for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due." So here's Jesus standing here, the crowd yelling, "Crucify." Jesus standing there while Pilate is saying he's innocent. Look at verse 7. The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die because he made himself out to be the Son of God." Notice they don't agree to take Jesus. Pilate had said at the end of verse 6, "Take him yourselves." They know they don't have the authority to crucify him, and they don't want to crucify him. They insist that Pilate handles this. They want Rome to handle this because they don't want to bear any of the blame down the road. So here in verse 7, they say, "Whatever your decision is, Pilate, it doesn't make any difference to us. We disagree. By our standards of the law, he deserves death. You are duty bound to sentence him to death. This is what our law says." Specifically, he made himself out to be the Son of God. Now, in their minds, they had thought that Jesus was blasphemous and guilty of this particular crime, they would say, for years. You can go all the way back to John chapter 5, John chapter 8, and see them trying to kill him because he was declaring himself to be the Son of God. However, we also know that before the Roman authorities, they hadn't mentioned this yet. Their accusation was what? Treason. He's declaring himself to be a king. But here they switch to the spiritual. Why did they wait? They might have thought that if we bring this spiritual charge, the Son of God idea, before the governor, he's not going to understand. He's a pagan. He's not going to care about religious matters. And so we're going to go with the political idea of Jesus declaring himself to be a king. But now, when they see that every method that they've tried to bring forward has failed, they present the one and only charge that was truly official. This was the charge that the religious leaders had made against him: Annas, Caiaphas, and the Sanhedrin. So at least they're being honest here. And it is true. He said he's the Son of God, and he is the Son of God. Jesus is acquitted by Pilate, mistreated by the soldiers, hated by the Jews. Finally, he's feared by Pilate. Look at verse 8. Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, that Jesus was the Son of God, he became more afraid. This is new information. But why is he afraid? Just entering into his mind, just for a moment, wouldn't be a good place to live, but a place to visit. He's becoming more gradually aware of the unusual nature of this case. He's in a predicament. He's heard the accounts of the past miracles, the popularity and the teaching, especially that week, done by Jesus. He's heard from Jesus himself this mysterious idea that he's a king and he has a kingdom, but it's from a different realm. He's had him flogged, allowed mockery and mistreatment. He's even joined into the mockery. And so he's shaken by Jesus' words and his actions. You add to this a detail that only Matthew gives us. Listen to what Matthew says. While Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message saying, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him." More mystery. Was this a genuine message from above? We don't know, but the words "Son of God," spoken by the Jews, intensify Pilate's fears about everything going on here. Could it be that this extraordinary man is truly divine and he has appeared on earth? More conflict in Pilate's soul. Look at verse 9. And he entered into the praetorium again. You can see the back and forth that's going on here. Inside, outside, inside, outside. And he said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" He's exasperated. But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate didn't deserve one. The reality is Jesus had already told him where he's from. He's from heaven. Verse 10, because Jesus is silent, we read this. So Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and I have authority to crucify you?" Increasing frustration, irritated by Jesus' silence. Pilate now tries to cover his fear with boasting, talking about who he is, how important he is. "Don't you know," he says to Jesus. We often say the same thing to God, right, in our prayers? "Don't you know, God?" And then explain to him what's going on so that he will see things our way. But here, Pilate talking to Jesus, "Don't you know I had the authority to release or crucify?" Under normal circumstances, this kind of statement would draw the prisoner into the thinking of the governor. The prisoner would have some kind of hope of freedom if he could give a good answer. He would have fear of being crucified if he gave the wrong answer. He would at least say something, but this is not normal. Jesus is not merely in custody like a normal man. Pilate thinks that he himself, the governor, is in control. The reality is, Jesus is in control. Pilate is looking for help from the prisoner in getting out of this situation. Jesus does offer this in verse 11. Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above." Now, on the political level, Pilate had been given his authority from Caesar. But Jesus, of course, is speaking of something higher. Romans 13:1, there is no authority except from God, and all those that exist have been appointed by God, including Pilate and including Caesar. So in making this statement, Jesus is saying that Pilate is answerable to God. And then we come to the end of verse 12, or verse 11. "For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." Jesus is speaking of Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin, the religious leaders. Why? Well, because they know more. They should have known better than this pagan governor. You know, the scripture teaches, to whom much is given, much is required. The religious leaders also have their authority. It's also from God, but they are misusing theirs. They're abusing it. And in fact, they're using Pilate for their own depraved plans. So if there is a comparison between the two, Jesus says the leaders are in greater sin. Verse 12, As a result of this, we would like to read, Pilate let him free. But it does not say this. As a result of this, Pilate kept seeking to release him. He goes outside again and talks to the crowd. And we would say, well, at least Pilate's not like Caiaphas or Annas, like Jesus has already stated. And he's not like Judas, who betrayed Jesus. He really is conflicted. You can imagine him thinking, the day started off so normally. What happened? There's this external tug of war between him and the religious leaders. And then there's an internal tug of war in his own soul between doing what's right and being afraid to offend the Jews. Pilate is a morally weak man. He's not willing to do what's right. And so he goes out, again, verse 12. He keeps seeking to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar." They're stating that your loyalty is not with Caesar if you release him. This is a direct threat against Pilate. He could lose everything if this went against him. Their words implied that if you release Jesus, you will be the enemy of Caesar. We will, of course, you could hear the religious leaders saying, lodge a formal complaint against you. And in that formal complaint, we will tell the emperor that you condone high treason against the government, that you released a man who was guilty of continuous sedition, who allowed himself to be called King of Israel. What do you think is going to happen then, Pilate? What hypocrites these shrewd religious leaders are. Why do we say that? Pilate knows, and you and I know, these religious leaders hated the Roman government. But they were quick to use the Roman government as a threat against this person in order to get their will accomplished. They're lying. They're pretending to be loyal to the emperor by making the statement, "You are no friend of Caesar if you release this man." And then identifying Jesus again at the very end of verse 12, everyone who makes himself to be a king opposes Caesar. So they began with charges of treason. After several interactions with Pilate, they went to the Son of God statement, and now they're back to the treason. The Sanhedrin have caught Pilate in their trap. They tried to do this to Jesus over and over again, right? During this week between the triumphal entry and what we're reading here, but they couldn't. But we must understand that Jesus is not caught in a trap. He easily could have silenced the whole situation by speaking to the crowd, speaking to the leaders, speaking to Pilate. He could have easily called down legions of angels to take care of the whole situation, as he spoke about in the Garden of Gethsemane just hours previous. He could have easily slipped away, as he had done several times in his ministry when it wasn't time for him to be taken into custody. Instead, out of obedience, we see Jesus willingly determined to move through his trials on the way to the cross. Why does he do this? Out of obedience to the Father and love for the sheep. As we began midstream, we end midstream. Lord willing, we'll pick up again next Sunday. As we see this continuation of the Roman trials, we see Jesus acquitted, mistreated, hated, and feared. And as we did last week, let me give you 3 application points to take from this. It's enough just to chew on what we're reading here. But as you think about your own spiritual life, number 1, do right regardless of consequences. You don't have to live in conflict like Pilate did, trying to think about, well, if I do the right thing, what's going to happen? Just eliminate the what's going to happen. It doesn't matter what's going to happen, and just do the right thing. Period. Number 2, trust yourself to God when you're suffering. We see Jesus doing this as we move through the upper room through the arrest, now through the trials, and soon to the cross, he entrusts himself to God. You will have times of suffering in your own life. This is just part of living the Christian life on earth. And you are called to entrust yourself to God. In fact, Peter, 1 Peter 4:19 says, those who suffer according to the will of God must entrust their souls to a faithful Creator. Third, remember what Jesus did for you. You know, we all fall short of God. There are times where we will not do right. We'll give in to whatever the consequences are. There are times where we don't trust God as we're suffering. There are times where we simply sin. And this is why we need Christ. Everything he is moving through now is on behalf of the persons who put their faith in him.